However, we have this event of similar scale that's happened in South Asia at around the same time, around the end of the world wars, where nearly 1% of the population became homeless almost overnight, and 14% of the population was affected, 14% of the global population, yet it's hardly been documented at the same level as the other events. And so we don't understand it to this day as much as we should, because the impacts are felt to this day. In fact, the biggest, the most sort of widely known impact is the Kashmir issue that's still ongoing and is sort of a global threat. So the problem we discovered was that, well, the problem as a layperson in the field of oral histories was that we did not have any primary source for the general public. I was a part of the general public at the time to learn from, but also that does not exist for academics. And the urgency was that the people who had these memories, they were over 80 plus, and that population was quickly dwindling. I don't need to go into the end of the British Raj in South Asia. You already know that story. And just to give you a glimpse at the Radcliffe Lines that were drawn in 1947, but everybody here is familiar with South Asian history, so I don't need to talk about that. I saw that I'm supposed to talk a little bit about the background of this. Just to give you my background, even though I'm not a South Asianist by profession, I did grow up really close to the border between India and Pakistan. I did grow up watching Indian television, state-controlled television, and Pakistani state-controlled television. And I grew up going to the border quite often because I knew our family had come from the other side. So I come from a migrant family. And I knew that that story was not being told the same way that I heard about it in my family. Like what I heard in my family was in contrast to what was in the textbooks. Often the story was completely missing from school textbooks altogether. And I knew I always wanted to do something about that. So the inspiration came when I was finishing up my part of my PhD research in physics in Tokyo, and I took a trip down to Hiroshima. I visited the Peace Memorial. I spent like 3 days down there, but what really hit me were the oral histories, and I realized in that moment that the oral histories sort of were a source of so much, not only inspiration, but understanding around the events. And I realized that, if people heard the stories of partition from people like my grandmother and others, millions of others like her, who went through it, there was a lot of bits of information that was not documented in any physical document that existed spread amongst the people, but also the people's stories ignite researchers to do work by inspiring them on a visceral level, the human aspect of it all. So I left my job in 2013 from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where I was doing a postdoc. I was at the end of my postdoc and looking at faculty positions, and decided to do a career shift and let go of my income and started an NGO and started working on this. We saw that there hadn't been any efforts to document oral histories, and no one was really taking this seriously. And as lay citizens, we decided to do it ourselves. By we, I mean I really wanted to do this. I started out on my own, just on my hobby camcorder, with absolutely no intention of creating an organization or an archive for anybody. But I realized that there was just so many people who wanted to tell me their story. There was an actual need in the community. So I went around, started asking people, who wants to do this with me? And I was at UC Berkeley at that time. And a bunch of people signed up. They were like, yeah, let's do this. So it was just a bunch of us random people with camcorders going around doing this. And eventually we realized what we were doing had a name for it. It was called Oral History. And we connected with the regional oral history office at UC Berkeley, who trained us in how to do this properly. And so we devised some methodology around our work. And we decided to teach anyone anywhere who wanted to record these stories, because these stories were spread around the world. So we created a webinar that's free and it's offered weekly. So people started signing up from everywhere, from Israel, from Africa, from Hong Kong, places we had absolutely no idea that there would be partition survivors and witnesses. And they started recording these stories and submitting them from around the world. And social media, Facebook and Twitter, were our primary means for spreading the word. So like I said, at the time, we had no idea what we were getting into, and that there was actually, there was a field around this. We were just lay people, but thankfully we got support from the right scholars. So we came up with a mission. Our mission was to document, preserve, and share eyewitness account from all ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic communities. I know that sounds really normal, but sitting here in the US, but in India and Pakistan, it is not normal. People would be like, wait, you're of Punjabi Sikh background. Why are you recording Sindhi stories? Or why are you recording Bengali stories? And having grown up half of my life in the US, I was just like, what? Why would we not record stories from anyone who was affected by partition? So that was an idea that over the last 7 years since we've started this work, it has become accepted. And now people do accept this archive that is belonging to everybody. But it did take, we did have to sort of bring down a lot of walls with a lot of people in order to get to that place. So crowdsourcing helped us do this in a way that was fast, frugal, because we had no funding. It was global, so we could use social media and the modern technology to get to people everywhere very quickly. And it was engaging because not only were we preserving these memories in an archive, but they were being preserved within the families, and suddenly everyone was talking about it at a grassroots level. And this memory was, which was almost gone, is now starting to become a part of conversation. And we've seen huge public shifts since we began this work and tried to make it popular on social media in India and Pakistan. I kind of already talked about how it works. People go out, people train, go out in their communities, record the stories, upload them, we share them. It inspires even more people to go out and do that. So that's just a visualization of what's happening. The stories come in from everywhere. We're managing the cloud from our office in downtown Berkeley. So far, in this manner, we've recorded over 5,300 oral histories on digital video, mostly HD, because we highly push people to do the latest formats. It's actually, it turns out it's over 8,000 hours. It says 6,000, over 8,000 hours of video footage. So it's like way more than, we're trying to figure out how to manage all this data because it's coming in at such a rate that we are not even able to handle it with the resources we have. Over 550 people have volunteered to contribute these stories. We're calling them citizen historians, sort of like citizen journalists. They've submitted the stories from 12 countries, from over 400 cities and villages in 22 languages. Some of the languages are endangered. And there's over 800,000 followers on social media. And these stories, I think just in 2017, were shared over 10 million times. So it's really kind of popularized this idea of preserving memories of partition. Our goal is at least 10,000 oral histories. And you don't need to know about the costs and stuff, but so if you go on our website, we had some volunteers who made this map. You can click on a city, you can see the stories from that city, and you can watch clips. We don't have the full videos up. We are working with Stanford's digital repository and getting the videos streamed anywhere and making them openly accessible. So that is an ongoing project. In fact, there's a slide, and we have a couple of universities in India and Pakistan that are going to be receiving the videos. That's just a pilot that's being supported by Tata Trusts in India. And then we'll see how that works out so that we can then bring these videos to universities everywhere, maybe a little bit similar to the Shoah Foundation. But we have the advent of having started much later, for better or worse. Obviously, we lost a lot of the witnesses, but we can start out on a different technological footing, so it's easier for us to get the stories out. So the archive is already actively in use, even though the stories are hard to get to at this point. You have to come to our Berkeley office because we're still working on getting them out there to the world. So we have a number of museums that have licensed them in Canada and in South Asia. We have a number of plays that are out there already, a number of several documentaries. In fact, a really prominent BBC documentary last year primarily used the archive for research. A famous Bollywood film, Bhag Milka Bhag, about Milka Singh, the runner who got the Olympic runner who got his career started at the time of partition. They used the archive for research. So it is already showing itself to be a valuable resource. Just to share, if I have time, a few learnings. This is just 3 or 4 weeks ago. I was in the Sundarbans. I absolutely had no idea that the Sundarban mangrove forests were so connected to partition. It turns out that in 1947, the biggest settlements in Sundarbans happened at that time. Refugees coming from Bangladesh, I'm looking at just the Indian side, refugees coming from Bangladesh were settled there in big numbers, but not all refugees. These happen to be refugees from the lowest castes, because the upper caste refugees were often given land in the cities and in inland where the land was more arable. But the Sundarbans, for in terms of economic opportunity, are considered somewhat of a, I hate using this word because it's so subjective, wasteland, as I hear over and over again when I was out there. But a lot of these people were settled there, and it turns out that they did not have those ancient bodies of knowledge in their families on how to adapt to this land. So you have a lot of danger, you have lots of tigers, you have alligators. And so as a result, you have all of these so-called tiger widows, all of these women who've lost their husbands to tiger attacks. And this particular man that we were interviewing on the left, he's one of the rare ones. He's 108 years old, and he has survived. No birth certificate, but we had to infer his age from his son, who is almost 90, who's sitting next to him. And he does have a birth certificate, and also the events. Like, he knew Daniel Hamilton, the person who tried to create colonies in the Sundarbans. And he knew Rabindranath Tagore. He was his boatsman. So just from his knowledge of old historical observations, we could infer his age. But he survived 2 tiger attacks, so he's one of the few who has been able to fight that off. But it's really fascinating to see the ecological impacts of partition, just giving you one micro example of what the partition is bringing out through crowdsourcing. Like, otherwise, most of us had never heard of the impacts that partition had. And the other thing that's happening now is a lot of these same people that were refugees, that were settled in the Sundarbans, are becoming our first climate refugees. In fact, I think by 2020, 70,000 people in the Sundarbans will become homeless because of the rising sea level. So the grandchildren of the partition refugees are becoming climate refugees. There's just a photo with some of the tiger widows. Another example, so this gentleman, this is from Punjab. He is no longer alive, but he was 107 when he interviewed with us. There's a lot of incredible things he told us about the history of Punjab, or his observations from that time. But one thing that really stood out to me is the story of chai, which I always consider to be a staple South Asian drink. But he told me that he, to this day, boycotts it because there was a trend when he was a teenager to boycott chai, because it was believed that that people from the East India Company were going around and spiking people's milk to get them addicted to chai, so that they could sell more chai. So he's part of this movement that nobody's really alive from those days anymore, where they were boycotting chai in Punjab. So that's something I had never heard of until we interviewed this gentleman. Just stories of Caranas, musical Caranas that were broken up from the time of partition. Stories from the northwest frontier area in Pakistan, from languages that are disappearing, like this particular gentleman. He speaks Torwali, and there's only 3,000 speakers left. And there's not many recordings in that language. The archive now has some recordings in that language. Stories of Jewish migrants from the ancient Jewish communities in South Asia. This particular gentleman who's being interviewed by Erin Riggs, who actually is now doing her PhD on topics that she discovered in the archive. Now she's doing her PhD at Binghamton. But he migrated from Karachi to Pune, and then from Pune to Bombay, and then was recruited in 1948 by the Builders Movement in Israel. So a lot of young boys from Indian Israeli communities were recruited to go live in kibbutz, various kibbutz communities in Israel to help rebuild. And now he lives in New York. Yeah, are we done? Okay. So I will skip through pretty much some of the other stuff, but I'll just point out one more thing. That is, we also gain insights into things like the origin of the violence, which people talk about a lot. One of the things we find is that we hear these stories about neighbors killing neighbors. We hear it over and over again, but the archive contradicts that. In fact, what we hear over and over again is that neighbors were protecting neighbors. We've interviewed perpetrators of violence and victims, obviously, and we find that both tell us that people did not necessarily attack people they knew. They attacked people far away, maybe in a neighborhood far away or a village far away. And they were usually driven by the motive to loot. That was the largest motive. So it seems the violence was largely economically driven. It happened because there was a gap in, I guess, a vacuum in power for a little while. And the violence quickly stopped when military forces from elsewhere were brought in. And in a way, religion was used as an excuse, and it could have been anything. It could have been caste. That's what the stories are starting to tell us, but obviously this needs more scholarship. So I'm just giving you a very rough picture. And I'll just sort of stop there and say that there are some other projects that have been inspired by this one. A Partition Museum has just come up last year in Amritsar. The Harvard South Asia Institute, who we've been talking to for many years, is starting a similar initiative as well as of this year, as of last year maybe. So yeah, that's it. I'll stop right there.